Mason is a wealthy entrepreneur who works tirelessly, unaware that his wife, Lydia, only married him for his money. She doesn't hide her affairs and manipulates Mason, using his kindness to her advantage. When he starts suspecting something is wrong, Lydia deepens her game. But this time, Mason decides not to forgive. What will his revenge plan be? And can he truly let go of Lydia? Or will he once again fall victim to her manipulation? Mason sat in his office, watching the evening sun cast golden rays through the large windows. He was a successful businessman with an impressive portfolio and a luxurious lifestyle. Expensive cars, designer suits, and, most importantly, a beautiful family. His young and stunning wife, Lydia, and their 2-year-old son, Michael. But lately, something had changed. Lydia had become distant. She was always present but seemed lost in her own world. Mason noticed her constant phone use, the way her gaze had grown cold when he tried to talk to her. At first, he brushed it off, but the signs became too obvious. Lydia started staying late at work, always claiming she had important meetings. Mason's instincts told him something was off. He was a sharp businessman. His gut feelings were rarely wrong. Yet, he didn't want to jump to conclusions. One evening, arriving home earlier than usual, he found Lydia standing by the mirror, admiring herself. She was dressed elegantly, as if she had just returned from an exclusive event. When she noticed him, she forced a smile. "Hey, love," she greeted him casually. "I just got home." Mason studied her eyes, searching for something, anything. They hugged, but he felt an empty void inside. She looked as beautiful as ever, but why did her smile feel so fake? "You look stunning," he said, masking his suspicion. "Where were you?" Lydia hesitated before responding that she had an important client meeting. Mason heard her words, but deep down, he knew she was hiding something. That night, as he lay in bed, sleep evaded him. His mind raced with doubts and questions. What was Lydia doing? What was she hiding? The next morning, Mason confided in his longtime friend James, who had worked in their company for years. "Have you noticed anything off about Lydia?" Mason asked as they sipped coffee in his office. James sighed, his expression serious. "Mason, I don't want to make you worry, but have you considered that she might not be as committed to your marriage as you are?" Mason's heart tightened. "I don't know, man. Something feels wrong." "If your gut tells you something, don't ignore it," James warned. "You don't want to realize the truth when it's too late." That evening, Mason returned home to an empty house. Lydia hadn't told him where she was going. He decided he wouldn't wait any longer. Her phone was on the table. He unlocked it with the password he already knew. A message popped up. "I can't wait to see you again. Tomorrow night, as planned." Mason clenched his jaw. Who was this? And why was she so comfortable lying to him? Now, he knew. It wasn't just suspicion. It was the truth waiting to explode. Who is this man? And why is his wife hiding such an important detail from him? But he couldn't just ask Lydia that question. If everything turned out to be true, he would need to act carefully. All morning, Mason walked around the house, barely noticing his son, Michael, who was happily running around him. He tried to look calm, even when Lydia, once again looking flawless, walked into the kitchen and asked if everything was okay. "Everything's great," Mason replied, trying to hide his emotions. He knew she was pretending as if nothing had happened. There was a certain distance in her eyes, unlike ever before. Lydia smiled while making a cup of coffee, but Mason noticed that her smile was forced. Her eyes were focused on something else, something important, rather than what was happening in their home. "I have work to do, Mason," she said without looking up. "A meeting with clients, so I need to leave early today." Mason nodded, watching her movements. He could no longer ignore what was happening. Every move she made, every phrase she spoke, it all hinted at something deeper. Her glances, her silence, her frequent absences from home. These were signs that she was hiding something important. "Lydia, I want to talk," Mason said, stopping her at the door. She turned to him, looking surprised, but there was no warmth in her eyes like there used to be. "About what?" she asked. "About us. And your job. You've been disappearing more and more, and I'm starting to wonder why," Mason said firmly, though his voice trembled slightly with anxiety. You spend a lot of time away from home. I've seen the messages, Lydia. You're talking to someone, and I have the right to know who it is. Lydia didn't respond immediately. She looked away, then slowly turned her gaze back to him. Mason, you're starting to sound like a child. It's just work-related matters, nothing more. Don't lie to me. Mason raised his voice, though he didn't want it to turn into a fight. I saw the messages with another man. You're in contact with him, and I have no idea who he is. Lydia stood in silence, and then her expression changed. The mask of calmness she had been wearing began to crack, and Mason saw the first sign of her perfect facade breaking. You're overthinking this, Mason, she said defiantly. Maybe you should stop trying to control my every move? Mason felt his heartbeat quicken. Lydia had never been this aggressive before. This isn't control, Lydia. It's concern. I want to know who these people in your life are. You want to know? Her voice turned cold. It's my personal choice who I talk to. If you want to know more, maybe you should start looking for proof. Lydia turned and walked toward the door without stopping, not even waiting for his response. Mason stood there, watching her leave. He felt trapped, unsure if he had the right to take action. But he was determined. Now he was certain. He needed to find out more. A few hours later, after Lydia had left, Mason began his search. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but she had left him no choice. Going through her phone, he found exactly what he was looking for. More messages from the same man. One of them had a date. Let's meet tonight. You know how much I've been waiting for you. Mason barely kept his composure. She was meeting him, and this was more than just work-related matters. The feeling of betrayal consumed him, but he knew he couldn't act on emotion alone. He had to see this through to the end. And if Lydia had truly betrayed him, he wasn't just going to sit back and wait. Mason made a few calls and arranged a meeting with a private investigator. He wanted to learn more about this man and their meetings. It was a difficult decision, but he felt it was the only way to uncover the truth. What Mason didn't know was that Lydia was already making moves that would change everything. All her manipulations, all her secrets, now they took on a whole new form. Her game was just beginning, and she was ready to play several steps ahead. It was unclear whether Mason would find the evidence he needed, or if his revenge would go as planned. But one thing was certain. This battle wouldn't end quickly, and he had no idea what was waiting for him ahead. Mason couldn't sleep all night. The memories of those messages haunted him. Lydia wasn't the woman he had loved. She had become a stranger, and all those moments he had cherished in his heart now felt empty and fake. He still couldn't believe Lydia had betrayed him, but the facts he had found left him with no other choice. Early in the morning, he met with the detective he had hired to find out more about the man Lydia had been talking to. The detective was a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor. Mason didn't like these kinds of meetings, but he knew this was his only chance. So, we're dealing with someone quite experienced, the detective said, going through his notes. The man your wife has been in contact with is Edward Lawrence. He's a successful businessman, the owner of several restaurants, but his reputation, well, let's just say it's not the best. He's known for getting involved with married women. Mason clenched his fists as he listened. He had already suspected something, but now it was even worse. Lydia hadn't just betrayed him. She had chosen a man who knew exactly how to manipulate her weaknesses. What else did you find? Mason asked, feeling his heart tighten with rage. It seems they meet regularly, the detective continued. I have evidence that she has been to his restaurant several times, and not just as a customer. Mason couldn't take it anymore. He stood up and walked out of the office, feeling his blood boil. He had thought Lydia was his family, his life. But now, everything he had built seemed like a lie. He couldn't just let her walk away without consequences. When Mason returned home, Lydia was already waiting for him. She looked calm, maybe even slightly worried, but he noticed she didn't stand in her usual, recently relaxed posture. There was something new in her eyes, something hidden. Mason, what happened? She asked, looking at him with concern. Lydia, he began, trying to control his emotions. I found out about your meetings with Edward Lawrence. Did you think I wouldn't notice? She took a step back, her face suddenly turning pale. Mason, it's not what you think. I never meant to hide this from you. It was a mistake. Mason stared at her, his heart tightening from the betrayal. He could feel his anger growing. "You didn't mean to?" he repeated coldly. "And how many more of these mistakes have you made, Lydia? Or was this all planned from the moment you married me for my money?" She lowered her head, tears glistening in her eyes, but Mason didn't care. "Mason, you don't understand." Her voice weakened. "I was with you for Michael. I can't just leave you, but you never gave me what I needed. I couldn't take it anymore." Mason didn't want to hear her excuses. It was too painful. He turned and walked toward the door, but Lydia stopped him. "Mason, wait, let me explain." She grabbed his arm, but he pulled away. "No, Lydia, I don't want to hear any more of your explanations. I found out everything I needed to know. You betrayed me, and that's unforgivable." He walked out of the house and drove off into the unknown. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew he couldn't just let this go. Meanwhile, Lydia went to meet with Edward Lawrence to talk about the situation. She tried to maintain her composure, but inside, she was falling apart. "Do you really think Mason won't find out?" Edward asked, looking at her with amusement. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Lydia. Mason isn't someone you can fool that easily." Lydia sighed. "I thought he wouldn't notice. But now, everything has changed. Mason won't be the same anymore." Edward smirked. "He's strong, that's true. But your weakness is his strength. You know every situation has an ending, right?" Suddenly, the restaurant door opened, and Mason walked in. He was calm, but his eyes burned with disappointment. He didn't say a word. He simply sat down at the table and looked at Lydia. "This is your end," he said quietly, staring at her. "I found out more than you think." Lydia shuddered, but still tried to keep herself together. She didn't know what would happen next, but it was no longer the same as before. Mason sat at the table, his fists clenched. Lydia sat across from him, her face pale with tension. She knew this would be their last meeting. She already felt her world collapsing, but she couldn't stop. Every choice she had made led to this moment, and now, everything she had pursued was slipping away. Edward Lawrence sat beside her, watching them with a careless smile. He wasn't planning to interfere in the conversation, but was ready to back Lydia up if needed. His reputation allowed him to stay on the sidelines, but he was still in control. Mason slowly lifted his gaze, his eyes cold as ice. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" he said, his voice low and chilling. "Did you think your lies wouldn't explode when you least expected them to?" Lydia remained silent, unsure of what to say. She couldn't escape the reality that the life she had built with Mason was nothing more than a house of cards, ready to crumble at the slightest push. "You hid it so well," Mason continued, "until I started asking questions. Maybe you didn't realize it, but I'm always watching, always aware of what's happening." Lydia felt her heart race. She had thought she could manipulate the situation and that Mason would remain naive, but his words shattered her illusions. "Mason, I don't know how it happened," she said quietly, trying to speak to him as the man she still loved, even though she had betrayed him. "I can't turn back time. I made a mistake." Mason didn't take his eyes off her face. He could see in her eyes that she wanted him to forgive her, to let her be part of his world again. But now he understood that nothing would ever be the same. "You didn't just make a mistake, Lydia. You chose him. You chose him over us. And you know what? It doesn't matter anymore." He paused, looking at her with an expression that made it clear. He would not forgive her. "I don't want you in my life anymore." Lydia felt her soul sinking into an abyss. She had always known that her choices would lead to this moment, but she hadn't thought it would hurt this much. She grabbed Edward's hand, hoping for some support, but he just looked at her coldly. "You made your choice," he said with a smirk. "I'm not going to save you." She turned back to Mason, trying to appear confident, though inside, she was falling apart. "Mason, I love you. Maybe I made a mistake, but I still love you." Mason closed his eyes, his heart aching, but he couldn't let her take over his life again. He couldn't give her another chance. She had betrayed him, and that was unforgivable. "You don't love me," he said quietly. "You love yourself and what I can do for you. But love? That's not what you had with me." Lydia froze. She didn't know what to say. Her words no longer mattered. She couldn't even choose a path for herself anymore because her choices were now limited. She had chosen the wrong man, and now everything she had was crumbling. "I'm leaving," Mason said, rising from the table. "This is the end, Lydia." He walked out of the restaurant, leaving Lydia and Edward in the silence that swallowed the room. Lydia couldn't move, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She knew it was all her fault. Mason was gone, and nothing could change what had happened now. A few hours later, Mason sat in his office, staring out the window at the night city. He didn't know what to do next. Lydia had left him with an empty heart, but he knew he had made the right choice. He couldn't let his life remain in the shadow of her betrayal. Suddenly, his assistant appeared at the door. She was holding some papers and looked at Mason with concern. "Mason, there's something you need to see," she said, handing him the documents. He looked at her and took the papers. As he began to go through them, his expression changed. These were financial records containing information about Edward Lawrence. Mason couldn't believe his eyes. "This can't be," he whispered, stunned by the revelation. It turned out that Edward had been manipulating Lydia from the very beginning, and everything she did was part of his plan. Mason held the papers in his hands, but his mind struggled to fully grasp what he had just learned. The documents clearly stated that Edward Lawrence was not just some random man in Lydia's life, but someone who had been controlling her from the start. He was the one who had helped Lydia gain access to Mason's finances, opened doors for her in business, and had likely been behind most of her decisions. Mason placed the documents on the table, his heart pounding faster, but he couldn't let this shake him. This was all part of a bigger game, and he had no intention of being just another pawn on the board. "What are you going to do about this?" came the voice of his assistant from the doorway. Mason turned to her. It was Kate, an old acquaintance with whom he had worked long before he met Lydia. Kate was sharp, incredibly experienced for her age, and had an uncanny intuition. She was also the only one who had always seen the truth, even when Mason refused to acknowledge it. "This is just another confirmation that I was deceived," Mason sighed. "But Lydia and we haven't been us for a long time. I'm dealing with an entire network of people who have been using me for years." Kate stepped closer, lowering her head slightly, her serious expression becoming even more concerned. "Mason, I don't think you see the full picture yet. You think Lydia is the key figure in this scheme? But do you know who's really behind her?" Mason frowned, not fully understanding what she was implying. "Kate, what do you mean?" he asked. Kate sat in the chair across from him. "I don't want to scare you, but there's someone else. Someone you know, though you might not realize their role in this. Do you remember your old business partners?" Mason's face darkened. His business partner, Jonathan Rose, had always been loyal to him, but could he be part of a conspiracy? "Jonathan?" Mason asked doubtfully. "Yes," Kate confirmed, "but not just him. There's another person you've recently worked with. I found out about it by accident while reviewing financial reports." Mason felt a chill run down his spine. He started recalling everyone he had recently dealt with, and his gaze fell on the letters he was holding in his hands. "Was this all planned?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Think, Mason. You yourself said that Lydia was only using you for money. But we found out that she wasn't the only one. Someone is behind her, and that someone has quite a lot of power." At that moment, the office door opened, and a new character entered the room, Jonathan Rose. He was dressed in an elegant suit, his expression serious, but his eyes betrayed a certain nervousness. Jonathan had been Mason's old friend and partner. They had worked together for many years, and although their relationship wasn't perfect, Mason had always considered him a reliable ally. But now something felt off. "Mason, we have a serious problem," he said as soon as he saw the documents on the table. Mason looked up, and his heart started pounding faster. All these years, he had trusted Jonathan, but now something had changed. He sensed that this moment could be a turning point. "Jonathan, do you know what's going on here?" Mason asked, trying to remain calm. Jonathan tried to hide his anxiety, but in his eyes, Mason saw something that made his heart sink. "What do you mean, Mason?" he asked, pretending as if nothing had happened. Kate, sitting nearby, crossed her arms, observing the situation. "I think you know exactly what we're talking about," she said. "Don't you?" Jonathan flinched. Now he began to realize that things were not going according to plan. A flicker of disappointment crossed his face, but he decided not to make it too obvious. Mason, don't listen to her. He started again. This is all a fabricated lie with no real foundation. But Mason didn't believe him. He felt that Jonathan knew more than he was letting on, and that all of this was part of his plan. Mason decided to act. He was standing on the edge of a high-stakes game, where every move could lead to unpredictable consequences. I don't trust you anymore, Jonathan, he said, turning to Kate. It's time to move forward. Mason stared at Jonathan, his hands unconsciously clenching into fists. A whirlwind of thoughts raced through his mind, and he could no longer hide his disappointment. Years of trust, years of working together. It was all likely part of a slow-moving plan. Jonathan glanced nervously at him, trying to maintain composure, but Mason noticed how his finger twitched slightly on his jacket, his eyes resembling those of a man trying to escape from something irreversible. You were my friend, Mason said, his voice calm but filled with tension. How could you? Jonathan took a few steps forward, trying to appear convincing, but his facial expression was no longer the same one Mason had remembered. Mason, I have always done everything to help you. But there are things that, he paused, searching for the right words. There are things where choices have to be made. Kate sat in the shadows, watching the conversation unfold, but her eyes were fixed on Mason. She was ready to support him in any decision because she understood perfectly well that he was standing at the edge. I know what you did, Jonathan, Mason said, his voice growing firmer. But you can't justify everything. You went to great lengths to use me, and now I know who is behind all of this. Jonathan, realizing that Mason was becoming more confident, grew slightly nervous. His hand moved toward his pocket, but seeing that Kate was closely watching his every move, he hesitated. Mason noticed and raised an eyebrow. What are you planning to do, Jonathan? He asked. Are you going to run? Everyone in the room could feel the tension rising, as if on the verge of an explosion. Every movement seemed excessively loud, and even the sounds from the street felt distant and insignificant compared to what was happening in this office. Jonathan approached the desk, sat on the edge, and though his face wore a mask of calmness, inside, he felt as if he was suffocating. Mason, I'm sorry, he said quietly, but his words sounded like an attempt to buy his way out of his past. I had no right to betray your trust, but it wasn't enough. Mason had long realized that this was no longer just a mistake but part of a well-thought-out scheme. He began to understand that all these years he had been living in deception, and the one he trusted the most was part of this game. At that moment, Mason felt a strong jolt, a phone call. He pulled his smartphone out of his pocket, glanced at the screen, and saw the message from Lydia. You think you know everything, but not everything has been said yet. Those words awakened a new wave of anxiety in him. What did that mean? What did she know? How was she controlling all of this? Kate noticed his expression and realized that this message might be the thing that changed everything. Mason, don't take this as the end, Kate said, her voice gentle but filled with seriousness. This is just the beginning. You need to do something before it's too late. Mason didn't respond immediately, feeling his inner world collapsing. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about justice and what he could do to break free from this trap. I know what you're thinking, Jonathan said, watching his reaction, but there are things that can't be spoken out loud. It's all part of a bigger plan. Without looking at Jonathan, Mason started entering his password into his phone. Kate stood beside him, watching the screen. Another piece of news appeared, making Mason's heart stop. It turned out that Lydia and Jonathan had been executing a long-planned scheme. They hadn't just betrayed him emotionally. They had been manipulating his business, undermining his financial empire from the inside while he remained blind to their actions. Mason dropped the phone, his eyes filled with rage. You're telling me this was all planned? He asked, barely believing his own words. Jonathan didn't answer. He simply shrugged, as if this moment didn't matter. Mason took a step back, feeling the weight of his anger pressing down on him. This was a moment of choice. He was standing on the edge, and his entire life had led to this point. Kate, what do you think? He asked. How do I stop this? Kate looked at him again, her eyes full of determination. You can put them in their place, Mason, but it will require your determination. If you let them be, they will crush you. Mason knew that every next step would be crucial. Now, he had to decide whether he would remain under their control or find the strength to stop them. He still couldn't believe what had happened. Lydia, his wife, the one he had placed all his hopes on, had been playing her game all along. Now he knew that Jonathan was just a part of a larger plan. But what happened the next day surpassed all his expectations. All this time, he had tried to push away his suspicions, believing that his relationship with Lydia was perfect. She was a wonderful wife, a devoted mother to their son Michael, and nothing seemed to foreshadow any trouble. But now, as the first layers of truth began to peel away, he saw just how many secrets she had been hiding. That morning, after receiving her message, Mason couldn't just let things slide. He decided to act. He didn't want to be deceived anymore. He believed that even now, there was still a way to save himself. His anger fueled him because he understood that he couldn't trust anyone anymore. But Lydia, as it turned out, was ready to go to any lengths to keep him in the dark, even if it meant using another man for her own purposes. Mason stumbled upon something he never expected. He came home earlier than usual, trying to view the situation from a different angle, and saw Lydia sitting in the living room with a man he had never seen before. He stood in the shadow of the doorway, watching their movements. This wasn't just a casual meeting. They were talking while holding hands, and Lydia was laughing, her voice just as tender as it had been in the early days of their relationship. That moment tore Mason apart. He couldn't step forward, couldn't say anything. His heart started pounding faster. What did this mean? She had betrayed him again. She felt completely at ease, and he was just another part of her life she could easily leave behind. But this time, it was more than just betrayal. This wasn't about lies or intimacy anymore. This was about the strategic game she had trapped him in. Mason found the strength to step into the living room. Lydia flinched when she saw his face, but didn't have time to say anything. Mason walked up to her, silent, looking straight into her eyes. "Who is this?" His voice was quiet but heavy as stone. Lydia remained silent. The man sitting next to her began to stand up, but Lydia stopped him with a gesture. Mason felt his entire being fill with fury, and he didn't need any more proof. "This isn't what you think," Lydia said, but her words sounded empty, like just another lie. Mason didn't listen to her. He didn't believe a single word anymore. He was simply stunned by how far she had gone and how everything had been part of her game. "What else are you hiding?" he asked, his voice calm, but he felt the storm raging inside him. The man sitting next to Lydia, realizing that everything had been exposed, stood up and left, leaving the couple alone. Lydia took a deep breath, trying to turn the situation in her favor. "Mason, I couldn't. I needed a break from all of this," she said, her voice trembling, but it wasn't convincing. Mason could no longer tolerate these excuses. He felt everything inside him breaking apart. His love, his trust. It had all become part of a grand deception. She was no longer his wife. She had become his enemy. "This is your second betrayal, Lydia. How could you? How could you deceive me again when I trusted you?" he said, his words pouring out like a storm. "You're playing with my life, with my business, with our family. What does all of this even mean?" Lydia recoiled from him, her eyes filling with tears, but she was still trying to justify herself. "Mason, I don't want this. I don't want to destroy everything." Her words were insincere, and Mason could no longer listen. "It's too late, Lydia. I can't take this anymore," he replied, his voice thick with pain. "You've killed everything that was between us. You betrayed me more than once, and now I see who you really are." Mason turned and walked out of the room without looking back. He knew this story wasn't over yet. Now he was on the verge of a decision, and this decision wasn't just about Lydia. He had to decide whether he could forgive himself for staying blind to the lies for so long. This was the beginning of the end. Mason stepped out of the house without looking back. Every step, every breath felt heavy, as if he were carrying an unbearable weight on his shoulders. For all these years, he had thought Lydia was his hope, his support. And now it had all crumbled, like a row of dominoes that couldn't be stopped. He had no idea what to do next. But suddenly, as he walked through the gate, his phone rang. He didn't want to answer. No more conversations, he thought. But the call was from someone he hadn't expected. It was James, Mason's old friend who lived in another city and whom he hadn't spoken to in years. "Mason, are you busy right now?" came the voice from the other end. Mason frowned but decided to answer. "What's going on, James? You haven't called me in years." Mason's voice was as sharp as a knife. "It's important, brother. Something happened with Lydia, and I think you need to know about it," James replied. Mason froze. His heart skipped a beat. Why was James calling about Lydia? What could this mean? "Do you know something?" Mason couldn't hide his anxiety. "I don't know everything, but I think you'd rather hear it from me," James said. "Come over, and I'll tell you." Mason didn't have the strength to refuse. A growing sense of unease gripped his heart, something he simply couldn't ignore. He drove to James' place, feeling his mind flood with questions. A few hours later, he was sitting in James' living room. The man poured him a glass of whiskey and sat across from him. "Mason, I know you're already devastated, and I don't want to upset you more, but there's something you need to know about Lydia," James said. Mason stared at him intently. "Tell me," he said curtly, feeling his heart pound harder with each word. "Lydia, she wasn't just cheating on you with Jonathan. That was only the beginning." James placed his glass on the table and looked at Mason seriously. "She had ties with other men, and I'm not even sure how many. I know because I saw her going to a nightclub at the same time you were away on business trips. You have no idea what's really been happening." Mason felt the blood drain from his face. He couldn't believe his ears. "What are you saying? That she wasn't just cheating on me with Jonathan? You mean she?" "Mason, I don't want to scare you, but she's not just deceiving you. She's manipulating you, and none of this is an accident. She's planning something big, something you can't even imagine." James fell silent, as if trying to process his own words. Mason was stunned. He tried to wrap his mind around everything, but it was too much. All these years of trusting Lydia had been a mistake. How had he not seen this sooner? "I can't believe this," he whispered, feeling his throat tighten with pain. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? I was afraid you wouldn't understand me. But now I see that you need to know the truth," James replied. "And there's one more thing. She didn't just leave you for other men. Her motives are far more complex than you think." Mason looked at James, trying to understand what he meant. He began to feel that something in his life was at risk, and now this threat was not just about betrayal but about something much more serious. "What do you mean?" Mason asked, a hint of anxiety appearing in his voice. "You don't want to know all of this, but if you want to be ready for the next step, you must learn the truth," James said, his tone growing even more serious. Mason clenched his fists. The whole situation was becoming more and more unpredictable, and he felt his life gradually slipping out of control. "I'm ready to listen," he said, deciding to act and not leave anything to chance. "Lydia didn't just cheat on you. She had certain connections with your business partners and may have been using you for her own benefit," James revealed. "Her goal wasn't just your money but also your business, your connections. She orchestrated everything so that you wouldn't suspect a thing." Mason felt his breath catch. His wife, whom he loved, had betrayed him not just for emotions but for power and money. And now everything was unraveling like a tangled web of darkness. Now Mason knew that his life had completely changed and that he could no longer just stand by and watch his wife play with his emotions. This was the beginning of a new era, and he was ready to fight for his future. Mason sat in the darkness of his room, silently watching the clock. The pale yellow beams of the moon pierced through the window, and he felt as if every minute stretched into eternity. His mind was working at full capacity, going through all the facts he had learned from James. Lydia hadn't just betrayed him for another man. Her manipulations ran deeper than he could have ever imagined. It was clear now that behind her mask of the perfect wife hid a woman with dark intentions. Mason felt his entire life shifting, his belief in love and trust crumbling to pieces. All these years, he had tried to be kind and honest, giving Lydia all his love. And she had used it to execute her own plans. But the worst part was that Mason didn't know what to do next. Lydia was no ordinary woman, and her ability to manipulate people surpassed any expectations. He was faced with a choice, and it was a difficult one. If he exposed all her secrets, they would both be forced to live in the aftermath of the fallout. But if he left everything as it was, he would continue living in a lie. And the worst part was that he couldn't just leave her. Michael, their son, was in the middle of it all, and Mason felt it was his duty to protect the boy from this destructive reality. "What are you going to do?" he whispered to himself, unintentionally glancing at the mirror. His own reflection seemed foreign to him. Could he ever trust someone again who had been his ideal for so many years? At that moment, the door to the room opened, and Lydia's silhouette appeared in the darkness. Her eyes looked unnaturally calm, as if she had already prepared for this conversation. She stood in the doorway, her gaze fixed on Mason. "You found out the truth?" she asked quietly, her voice eerily calm. Mason couldn't tell if he felt anger or sorrow. His heart clenched in pain. You betrayed me, Lydia. And that's not even the worst of it. You planned to use me." He lifted his head, meeting her gaze. Lydia said nothing, simply walked toward him. Her movements were confident, as if she had already won this game. She sat down beside him, but Mason moved away, refusing to give her even the slightest closeness. "Mason, do you really think I wanted to use you?" Her voice turned cold and sinister. "You were just a part of my plans from the very beginning. I didn't marry you for love. You were a resource to me. And your money, your power, that's what interested me." Mason couldn't believe what he was hearing. All these years, he had tried to be the best for Lydia, giving her everything, while she had been using him for her own goals. "You cheated on me with other men, and all I got in return was lies." He barely restrained his anger. "How could you do this to me?" Lydia looked at him again, still calm. "Mason, you will never understand what I did and why. But I don't regret it. It was my choice, and I live with it." She stood up and moved closer to him. "You know why I did it. You've always been too naive." Her words hit him like a bullet. He felt his disappointment growing, and the pain was unbearable. "Are you telling me I don't understand anything?" he asked, raising his voice. "That you've been deceiving me all this time, and I was just your tool?" "Yes, Mason. You were just a tool in a bigger game," she answered mercilessly. "But it doesn't matter anymore. I'm done with you." At that moment, Mason realized that he no longer had a choice. Lydia was not the woman he once loved. She was just a manipulator, using him as a pawn in her own game. But everything was changing now, and he had to act. "You think it's that simple?" he asked, stepping forward. "Maybe you expected me to leave you without a fight. But you're wrong." Mason made a swift move and grabbed the documents lying on the table. Lydia didn't understand at first, but when she saw the look on his face, she realized that her time was running out. "You want to end it?" she said quietly, looking at him, her voice turning nervous. "You want to leave me? But you don't even know what I have in my hands." Mason didn't answer. His determination was unwavering. He knew the time had come. All of Lydia's manipulations no longer mattered. He had to decide what to do next, and no matter what happened, he wouldn't let her win. Mason stood, holding the documents containing all his findings about Lydia. She didn't look away. Her eyes had turned cold, almost empty. Mason saw how her confidence began to fade, but he still watched her, ready for the final move. He couldn't allow her manipulations to keep destroying his life. "You thought I would never find out, didn't you?" Mason said, locking eyes with Lydia. "About your meetings, about your affairs with other men. And look at what I found. You never even considered that this could turn against you?" Lydia took a step back, her hands trembling, but she didn't say a word. Instead, her expression changed. Instead of looking lost, she began to smile. A cruel smile. "Mason, you still don't get it?" Her voice was low and direct. "I didn't just cheat on you. I was destroying you. And all you ever did was help me. You were always just a step toward my real goals." Mason felt his heart leap into his throat. All his thoughts, his struggles, his hopes that Lydia had changed, everything had been an illusion. She no longer seemed like the woman he once loved. She was a stranger, full of deceit and manipulation. "You betrayed me, and now you think everything will just stay the same?" he asked, holding up the documents that contained all the evidence of her affairs. Lydia raised an eyebrow and looked at him as if she didn't understand his surprise. "You're naive, Mason. You know what? Maybe you're partly to blame yourself. You're too good for this world, and you believed in me until I destroyed you." Her words hit him like a blow. Mason realized that he had completely lost control. She was the player in this game, and he was merely a piece. But not all was lost. He had something she never expected. "You think you're in control?" Mason said, setting the documents aside and stepping closer to her. "No, Lydia, you're wrong." Mason, unable to hold back any longer, pressed a button on his phone. Within seconds, a video appeared on the screen, Lydia meeting her lover in their home. She had no idea that the security cameras had been turned on, recording everything. "You didn't just betray me. You tried to take everything we built together, using your connections with others," Mason said, his voice cold and firm. "I found everything." Lydia turned pale. Her confidence was slipping, but she still tried to keep her composure. She knew that her future now depended on how well she could get out of this situation. "You can't do this, Mason," she whispered, though her voice was already weak. "You can't win." But Mason didn't respond. He placed his phone on the table, and another video appeared on the screen. A document confirming her financial fraud. She had tried to hide her assets, but he had tracked every single move. "Now, I do things my way," he said, and his words sounded like a verdict. Lydia couldn't believe what was happening. Her manipulations had failed. She looked as if darkness surrounded her, and now she realized that Mason had played a much smarter game. "What are you going to do now?" Lydia asked, her voice weary and filled with fear. Mason took the final step. He didn't say a word. He simply looked at her. And then, without another word, he placed the divorce papers on the table in front of her. Lydia fell silent for a moment, her face reflecting her defeat. She no longer had the strength to fight, but she still tried to maintain her composure. Her plan had failed. "I'll make this quick," Mason added quietly. "You won't manipulate my life anymore. You've lost everything." Lydia, unable to withstand the blow, dropped to her knees, pain filling her face. She had lost everything she had, and this was her ultimate downfall. Mason took a step back and walked out of the room, leaving Lydia in the darkness of their shattered world. And so, their story ended. Do you think Lydia deserved Mason's revenge after all her manipulations and betrayals?